Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to a new episode. May I kidnap you? I will tie you up and take you to the Caribbean on November 17th, 1781. It will be entertaining. You will find an English ship called the Zone sailing in the Caribbean. On board were 442 people, men, women, and children, forcibly taken from their countries in Africa and packed into the ship like cargo. After a few weeks, those enslaved passengers began to fall ill. They were crammed into filthy, unhealthy conditions with shortages of water and food, so they became sick. What happened next was that the ship's crew, the people responsible for them, instead of caring for them or feeding them or bringing a doctor to examine them, decided to do something strange and extremely horrific. The enslaved people were thrown alive into the sea. Why did they do this? Simply because the ship owners had insurance on those people. So when they lost something or their goods were damaged, they could claim compensation from the insurance company. Can you imagine that when the slaves died at sea, they were treated as damaged goods? But if they had died on board due to illness, there would have been no compensation. The ship returned and began to ask the insurance company for compensation. The company said it needed to study the matter more closely and refused. A legal dispute arose. Yes, someone must avenge the victims' lives and punish those criminals. Unfortunately, the case was not what you think. Let me tell you that when the case reached the British courts in 1783, it was not a murder trial, but a financial dispute over an insurance payout. The argument, and I am very serious, was whether throwing the slaves overboard could be considered a necessity to save the ship or whether it was deliberate damage to defraud the insurance company. Let me tell you, the first ruling was in favor of the ship owners, and it was overturned after an appeal. Still, none of the crew or owners were punished. Can you imagine more than 130 human beings killed in cold blood, and none of the owners or crew got what they deserved? The law at that time treated slaves as commercial cargo that sank, a shipment ruined by water. And despite the cruelty aboard the Zone, first, this was not a crime, at least according to the English judiciary, nor an exception. It was an extension and a central part of the institution of slavery. We usually talk about slavery as something created by white men and belonging to them, but in reality, slavery occurred everywhere in the world. It is a social and economic phenomenon that most likely happened in every region of the world and in many civilizations. You can find it in India, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and many others. In almost every region of the world, there was some form of control over people and their conversion into property. A slave might be a war captive, a kidnapped person, someone in debt, or a child born into an enslaved family. For example, in the Arabian Peninsula, dark skin became associated with slavery. In Greece and Rome, anyone different from them, whether African or even Germanic, was seen as lower class and more fit for slavery. Despite this exploitation, there remained, although narrow, a door through which one could leave slavery. For example, some slaves tried to buy their freedom or gradually integrate into society. This resembles what happened in China or the Arabian Peninsula as examples. There were also religious motives that could free slaves, as happened in Islam, where freeing slaves is considered a pious act. Sometimes slaves could reach high positions despite being enslaved. In the Ottoman Empire, slaves could rise to higher offices. Some children were taken from the Balkans and raised as soldiers and administrators. Some, like Sicilian Muhammad Pasha and Sinan Pasha, came close to the Sultan and influenced his decisions. Imagine being an advisor while you were a slave. What I want to say is slavery was not born in Europe. It spread across the whole world. I do not want to hear anyone say, "We are good and great. Our history is free of nonsense." No, it spread everywhere. Do not pretend. Excuse me, since you say that, why did I start by talking about a European sailing with Africans? That is a very good question. Allow me to answer. What happened in Europe between the 15th and 19th centuries was a terrible qualitative shift. For the first time in history, slavery ceased to be a local practice. It became a global institution based exclusively on race and skin color, meaning someone could become a slave not because they were a captive or a debtor or anything else, but simply because they had a different skin color. You have a different skin color? Come here. I will make you work for me, so I can get my cup of tea. English tea destroyed everything. If we had not added sugar to tea, there would have been no slavery. Sugar plantations ruined entire continents. Millions of Africans were classified as slaves from birth. You are born and suddenly find yourself in a global system where you are a slave, treated like a prisoner, and shipped away. The mindset of the Industrial Revolution begins to take over. Now you must be packed in a specific way, transported to certain places, and subjected to a regimented system with fixed rules and efficiency. Join the production plant. Become part of the assembly line. You enter an entire system whose aim is to build empires and amass wealth by enslaving you. A system with no hope and no exit. This system began around the 15th century when the world entered a new phase marked by European expeditions. Portugal was among the first states to realize that control of the sea was enormously profitable. It began when Prince Henry the Navigator encouraged sea voyages along the African coast. He sought new trade routes to India. Our food tastes bland. We need spices. We will go to India to bring spices. His goal was to find new routes because he wanted to bypass the routes then controlled by Muslims. While the Portuguese were roaming the African coasts looking for a trade route to India, they suddenly discovered a completely different opportunity. Why trade only goods, they thought. We trade raw materials, so why not trade the people responsible for producing them? Why not trade labor? At first, it was like a startup. We conduct limited kidnappings, test our product, create a minimum viable product, then go to market to see if there is demand. They proceeded slowly, experimenting with kidnapped people or buying war captives and other small-scale ventures. They discovered demand. My God, why has demand for slaves suddenly increased? Why did this happen? During this period, Europe was expanding, a kind of expansionism. Spain and Portugal had just discovered the New World, the Americas. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, a major problem emerged. Now we have vast new lands. How do we control them? How can we use these lands to grow sugarcane, or to mine precious metals and operate them? At first they thought, why not use local people, the natives? We will use them as labor. But, as I mentioned earlier, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought germs and epidemics. When these diseases reached some areas, they killed 80 to 90% of the indigenous population. These epidemics devastated indigenous communities. Millions died from smallpox, measles, and influenza. One could say the goods were damaged. It did not stop there. Attempts to enslave them were met with resistance. So Europeans punished and killed many of those who remained. The result was that Europeans found themselves in need of a new source of labor. Here they found a solution. Where did they go? This time to Africa. Why Africa? Why not try to import European slaves? As I said, Europe needed massive numbers of workers. Europeans were not suitable simply because they could not tolerate the heat. They were fine, but they were not accustomed to such high temperatures, so if forced to work on plantations, they would fall ill and die quickly, and you would be the loser. However, if you look at Africans, their skin protects them from deadly sun and high temperatures, so you get goods with a longer shelf life and a better return on investment. I will use all the business speak I learned from Shark Tank. Let me tell you that Europeans try to send European workers through a paid servant system, known as indentured servitude, temporary slave contracts to work in the new colonies. This is moving. They offered partial bondage, then full bondage, then retirement from bondage. Of course, that did not work because Europeans enjoyed relative legal protections. At that time, they had what could be described as rights. A person could go to court. Also, the contracts were temporary, so they could be freed at the end of the term and might even receive rewards like small plots of land. The whole scheme became costly and burdensome and could not reliably supply labor. If you recall, the church was powerful then, so it was very difficult for it to accept enslaving Christians. We have also seen the Catholic Church issue decrees that encouraged and even justified enslaving others. For example, the papal bull Dum Diversas issued in 1452. That decree allowed the Portuguese to enslave non-Christians. It provided moral and legal cover for invading Africa. It even created, from their perspective, a religious duty to go to these places to spread Christianity. Ironically, if they spread Christianity, they could not enslave Christians, so they should not spread Christianity too much. Over time, all these justifications built a broader racist narrative. During that period, this racist narrative created a kind of display window that made it appear virtuous, titled the white man's burden. You, white man, have a duty, a moral burden to bear. You must take control of non-Europeans and lead them to civilization. Don't go to civilization alone. Take an African with you. Take an Asian, or take me. It didn't stop there. Biological claims also appeared, eagerly adopted by Europeans without second thought. They said Africans had stronger bodies, were used to extreme heat like that of the American colonies, and that their nature suited hard labor and their bodies had greater immunity to disease. It's like that friend who praises your cooking so much that you end up cooking for him again. All of this portrayed slavery as a humanitarian duty, something Africans were supposedly created for. Over time, Portugal succeeded in expanding and systematizing the slave trade. They made agreements with local chiefs and African middlemen. Find the best broker in Africa to bring us strong slaves, especially from places like Guinea and Angola. They bought war captives and kidnapped people in exchange for European goods such as weapons, wool, and silk. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty divided the world between them. Portugal took Brazil and parts of Asia and Africa, while Spain controlled the rest of the Americas. This treaty established a new global colonial order with slavery at its core. Portugal built its colonies in Brazil and relied heavily on Africans to cultivate crucial crops like sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco. Sugar, my friend, was the white gold of that era, and demand for it was immense. Chocolate-coated nuts, anything containing sugar, sold in huge quantities. That's why bringing Africans to Brazil became a highly profitable business. It wasn't just Portugal. Spain also depended on African labor for plantations and mines in the Caribbean and Latin America. Thus emerged a highly profitable trade triangle. Ships left Europe loaded with goods, transported them to the Americas across the Atlantic, and returned to Europe loaded with sugar, tobacco, and coffee. This trade structure helped many European cities accumulate massive wealth. In fact, this was one of the main reasons for Europe's modern development and even its current prosperity. On the other hand, Africans entered a period of exploitation that lasted more than 300 years, known as the transatlantic slave trade. You, as a human being, were exchanged for sugar, tobacco, and other goods. By the beginning of the 17th century, the transatlantic slave trade had become a vast global trading system. Portugal and Spain were already pioneers, but soon new startups and other players entered the market. Competitors appeared and grabbed market share. The new players were Britain, France, and the Netherlands. They realized this was their chance to build empires. The British joined the triangular trade with a new model, joint stock companies, such as the Royal African Company. Why rely on a single merchant risking his whole voyage? That's inefficient. There should be investors who buy shares at fixed valuations. If the ship returned with profit, it was divided. If it sank or was robbed, the loss was shared. This reduced risk margins and provided a huge, steady source of capital. By the way, I'm still half joking when I call it venture capital, but it really was a form of venture capital. It was one of the earliest high-risk, high-return investments. When it worked, profits were unbelievable. So yes, the analogy fits. This trade began to expand institutionally. Ships left Liverpool, London, and Bristol loaded with European goods, exchanged them for humans in Africa, then sailed across the Atlantic to deliver the shipment to the Caribbean or American colonies. France joined the game too, with its Caribbean colonies like Haiti, relying on African slaves for sugar and coffee plantations. All domestic labor. Haiti became like a 17th century Starbucks. The Dutch, masters of the sea in the 17th century, of course didn't stay silent. They established massive companies and, more importantly, created a new financial system. Through the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, they provided traders with funding through loans, bonds, or shares. They also created maritime insurance, guaranteeing compensation for traders if a ship sank or was robbed. This turned slave trading from a perilous voyage into a relatively secure and profitable enterprise for investors. The result was that the slave trade became a tightly connected global network in which every European power played a part. The greater the demand for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the higher the profits, and the greater the need for labor. The system expanded and grew harsher, deepening the suffering of Africans. And here emerged what became known as the Middle Passage, the central, brutal journey of the transatlantic slave trade. This voyage took 5 to 8 weeks for European ships to sail from Africa to the Americas. It was called the Middle Passage because it was the second leg of the triangular trade. Olaudah Equiano wrote his memoirs about the Middle Passage, where he was enslaved and underwent that horrific experience. He was one of those who endured it and described the ships as hellish. The ships were modified to carry as many slaves as possible. Each enslaved person had to fit into a space of about 180 centimeters by 40 centimeters. They were shackled and stacked like cargo. They could not move. They slept on one side only during another voyage that lasted 5 to 8 weeks. There was no stretching room. You were chained with no ventilation or toilets. Of course, this helped diseases spread quickly, such as smallpox and yellow fever. Anyone who died was treated as damaged goods and tossed overboard. Just get rid of the rotten slaves. According to historians, roughly 15 to 20% of those Africans died before reaching the other shore. 1 or 2 out of every 10 did not complete the journey, not only because of disease, but because of the psychological trauma and physical brutality. Some slaves committed suicide. They tried to jump into the sea or refused food until they died. Some attempted uprisings and to seize the ship, only to be killed by the crew. Others died simply because Europeans wanted to terrorize the rest into obedience. Europeans did not regard them as human. They used horrific torture methods. They threw some slaves into the sea in front of others as a threat. The Middle Passage was merely a transport route, a tool to destroy afflicted humans. Africans entered it as individuals with identity, language, culture, and history, and left it as shattered commodities ready for sale, remaining so forever. That is one chapter. We are not finished. We move to the next chapter of exploitation when they reach the Americas. The ships were unloaded and Africans were displayed in markets. Traders examined African bodies, strength, teeth, and ages as if buying animals rather than people. After selling them, they did not go straight to the fields or mines. They first went through a seasoning phase. The goal was to break their will and turn them into obedient slaves. This was another program of psychological and physical torture. It began by separating new slaves from one another. Men were isolated from women. Any family or clan ties were cut to prevent unity. Any ties meant sympathy, and sympathy meant the possibility of collective resistance. Then they were forced to work long hours in high heat, all under the threat of the lash. A special diet was imposed to humiliate them, with small rations or strange foods. The aim was to instill the idea that obedience to the master was the only way to survive. They were beaten and publicly flogged for trivial reasons. As I said, sometimes as an example for others. One of the most important steps was depriving them of their African names. The name that carries memory, civilization, history, language, and everything, forget it. You're a new person with a European name from today on. You belong to the master's family. Of course, using your language or practicing your religion was forbidden. They wanted a human with no past, no language, no culture, and no history. When that ended, the seasoning phase was over. Your life as a slave in the fields or mines began. That was a new stage of torture. Brazil was the largest importer of African slaves in history, with nearly 4 million Africans. Sugarcane was the king crop there. Plantations were vast, and required work from sunrise to sunset. They cut sugarcane, transported it, and continued working in boiling and refining houses, all under extreme heat. Those who slackened from exhaustion were flogged, imprisoned, and sometimes killed. The situation in the Caribbean was no different. Sugar plantations in Jamaica and Haiti were hell on earth, to the extent that historians called sugar white death because so many died for it. The sugar added to tea was mixed with blood. In North America, specifically the South, other crops formed a full economy: tobacco, rice, and cotton. Remember, we are in the Industrial Revolution, so we now have machines like the cotton gin. That machine caused a huge surge in demand for cotton. Clothing production became easier. British textile mills were hungry for cotton. Bring me some African slaves and send them to the United States to produce cotton. We want to make clothes for people and make them happy. These factors made slavery organized and indispensable. It became the oil that powered production. Note I was talking about agriculture. I have not yet mentioned mining. Mines of silver and gold in Peru and Mexico were far worse. Many laborers died within months of work. They worked under extremely harsh conditions. A mine could collapse and take someone's life. Still, the production cycle had to continue. The silver they extracted helped Spain build its empire. If we delve into the world of slavery, we find that women suffered double hardships. They endured the same work and harsh conditions as men, plus sexual exploitation by owners and overseers. You will work like the men, miss, but we will sexually exploit you and assault you in ways we cannot assault the men. Harriet Jacobs wrote in her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, "When they told me my newborn baby was a girl, I felt a heavier burden than ever before. Slavery is terrible for men, but far worse for women." Harriet spoke of the daily harassment and abuse suffered by enslaved women. The body of an enslaved girl was treated as capital, worked, exploited, and violated by white owners. But it was more than that. Her body produced other bodies, generating more labor. Unlike a man's body, hers provided the owners with children who could be added as new property. The woman became a breeding cow. Harriet also described the unjust laws that protected white women from rape, while not even recognizing the harassment of enslaved women as a crime. One of the most famous examples was the state of Missouri versus Celia case, about an enslaved woman who was repeatedly raped by her master. When she defended herself and killed him, she was tried, and the judge and jury ruled that slaves had no rights as free people. She was sentenced to death by hanging. The cruelty did not stop with men and women. It reached the children as well. They were never safe from the moment they were born. Enslaved women often did not know who the real father of their child was, or rather, they knew but could never say for fear of punishment. Harriet wrote that her master fathered around 11 children. Even if a mother had spent her life serving her owner, like Harriet's grandmother, that did not protect her children. All of them were sold at auctions. Harriet recalled seeing a mother bring her 7 children to an auction, thinking that maybe a few would be sold. By the end, all 7 were taken. She screamed as they were sold before her eyes. Just as the transatlantic slave trade shaped the lives of every enslaved person, it also had a deep and lasting impact on Europe and the Americas. You could say it built the very foundations of the modern world, economically, politically, and socially. In Europe, the fortunes made from sugar, cotton, tobacco, and precious metals completely transformed the continent's economy. Cities like Liverpool and Bristol in Britain, Nantes and Bordeaux in France grew from ordinary ports into booming trade centers. The capital generated from this wealth flowed into banks and factories. It became one of the main engines of the Industrial Revolution. Ironically, the Industrial Revolution did not reduce human labor, it increased it. It created even more demand for the raw materials produced by enslaved Africans. Sugar and cotton powered the new machines. The revolution glorified itself, advanced Europe, and strengthened its armies, allowing it to dominate and intimidate other regions. Meanwhile, Africa was being drained of its people. Historian Patrick Manning estimated that over 12.5 million Africans were captured and enslaved between the 15th and 19th centuries. About 1.5 million died during the Middle Passage. Imagine that. These were the strongest men and women, chosen precisely for their endurance. The weak never even made it onto the ships. At least 4 million more died inside Africa during raids, imprisonments, and the brutal logistics of the slave trade itself. In total, the continent lost nearly 16 million people, what can only be called the greatest crime against humanity in history. The result was catastrophic. Africa's share of the world population dropped from 18% in 1600 to 6% in 1900. Some studies suggest that without slavery, Africa's population would have been larger by an additional 112 million people. Let me repeat that. The slave trade targeted the young and healthy, those between the ages of 15 and 35. When you remove a generation of youth from a society, you destroy its future. They were Africa's labor force, its dream, its hope. The continent plunged into chaos and violence. Political and social structures collapsed. Development stalled while poverty soared. This created a vicious cycle. One continent grew richer, while the other, robbed of its youth, grew poorer. The richer continent grew stronger, the poorer one weaker, and thus easier to exploit. Africa became prey for division. This era is known as the Scramble for Africa. Here, the economy shifted from one based on theft to one based on exploitation. When the slave trade was finally abolished, it was good news, but it created a problem for Europe. How will we drink or eat anything without sugar? They still wanted their frappuccinos, croissants, and rice cakes. What could they do? Work themselves? Of course not. Slavery simply changed form. It became local. Now the focus turned to Africa's raw materials: rubber, ivory, gold, and diamonds. In 1884, a very famous conference known as the Berlin Conference was held. The goal of this conference was to organize the process of colonization. We cannot continue colonizing in such a chaotic way. We will divide African lands to prevent conflicts between European nations. That was in Europe. In the United States, slavery was the main foundation of the economy. Without slavery, there would be no economy. By 1860, the total value of enslaved people exceeded $3 billion, equivalent to about $120 billion today. According to some estimates, their value was nearly equal to the combined worth of agricultural land and buildings in the southern states. Not only that, but it even surpassed the combined value of railroads, factories, and banks. This made slavery the largest form of capital in the country. Cotton production rose from 750,000 bales in 1830 to nearly 3 million bales by 1850. By 1860, the American South produced 75% of the world's cotton. This enormous wealth laid the foundation for the rise of the United States as an emerging superpower. Imagine becoming powerful simply because people wanted to look elegant. A similar scene took place in Latin America. Brazil, whose dependence on slavery made it the largest producer and exporter of coffee in the world, and it remains so to this day. Despite all this, some voices still claim that slavery and colonialism were not bad, but natural. Indeed, they might have been natural, just as anything that happens in nature is natural. However, the facts and figures show they were a catastrophe in human history. They were natural in the sense that they happened among humans, animals, and civilizations, but they were a disaster we must learn from and condemn. Modern Europe's wealth was built on the bodies of these populations. Did Africans submit to this oppression and tyranny? Did they resist it? Let me tell you, despite the brutality and extreme slavery in the Americas, the enslaved never gave up. Their resistance took many forms, from violent uprisings to small, everyday acts of defiance. As mentioned, many ships recorded cases of mutiny or takeover, though most failed due to the superiority of European weapons. Different forms of resistance appeared across the Americas. Some enslaved people escaped to the mountains or forests and formed their own communities, such as the Maroons. They fought white colonizers to gain freedom, like the Palmares community in Brazil, which survived for decades before being destroyed in 1694. Others used simpler methods, slowing down work, breaking tools, disobeying orders, or using songs and folktales to preserve their identity. Spiritual songs were used to express pain and the hope for freedom, sometimes containing secret messages about escape. Blues music expressed the sorrow and suffering of Black people and their hardships under oppression. Jazz evolved from these musical forms and became a symbol of creativity and identity for African Americans. Some resisted by forming unofficial marriages and insisting on passing African traditions to their children. Every form of resistance revealed that these people were aware of their humanity and rejected the system imposed upon them. They used all these acts to say, "We are human. We have identity and history." These rebellions forced the slave system to impose harsher rules and build networks of surveillance and repression. Yet this did not stop the emergence of revolutionary ideas that shook the system. This became clear at a crucial moment in the history of resistance to slavery. When and where did this happen? During the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution began. In 1791, enslaved people in Haiti launched a massive uprising, led by rebels such as Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. After years of fighting France, Haiti declared its independence in 1804, becoming the first Black-led republic in the world and the first modern nation to completely abolish slavery. Although the United States and Europe later imposed economic and political restrictions on Haiti, and France, ironically, forced it to pay enormous reparations, the Haitian Revolution was a global earthquake. It terrified slave owners everywhere and inspired one idea among millions of enslaved Africans: freedom is possible. A more significant intellectual resistance also emerged. The voices of new ideas against slavery grew louder, especially during the Enlightenment in Europe. Philosophers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and John Locke introduced ideas about freedom and human rights. Some, like Locke, even invested in the slave trade, yet overall their ideas spread the belief that freedom is a natural right everywhere. These ideas took shape during major events such as the French Revolution, 1789, and the American Revolution, 1776, both of which promoted slogans of liberty and equality. This created a contradiction we cannot ignore. How could they preach human rights while enslaving millions at the same time? This hypocrisy fueled more resistance to slavery. Some of the most powerful ideas came from true personal stories, like those of Alauda, Equiano, and Harriet Jacobs. When they published their memoirs exposing the horrors of slavery, they deeply affected European public opinion. It was similar to how Palestinian films today reach European audiences, allowing them to witness the extent of the genocide and tragedy firsthand. Let me tell you that just as slavery began with religious justifications from the church, new religious communities also emerged, such as the Quakers, who declared slavery as sin. All these factors gradually evolved into an organized movement, later known as the abolition movement. If we look back at the brutal Zone massacre that began this story, we find that when news of it spread across Britain, Europeans were horrified. They suddenly realized the horrific form of slavery they had been perpetuating. This shock fueled the growing abolitionist sentiment. New organized movements for the liberation of enslaved people began to appear. In 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in Britain. With massive public pressure through protests and sugar boycotts, the society gathered thousands of signatures demanding the end of slavery. In 1807, a law was passed banning the transatlantic slave trade, a huge milestone. By 1833, Britain had completely abolished slavery in all its colonies. France followed in 1848, the Netherlands in 1863, and Portugal in 1869. One by one, European nations followed this path. Only one remained: the United States. As mentioned earlier, things were far more complicated there. Its economy, especially in the South, depended heavily on cotton. Cotton required labor, and labor meant slavery. So, calling for the abolition of slavery in the U.S. was essentially calling for the destruction of its economy. This tension erupted into the American Civil War between the North and the South. The northern states opposed slavery, while the southern states depended on it. The war claimed around 600,000 lives, more Americans than those killed in World War II. To spoil the ending a bit, the North won and slavery was abolished. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. In Latin America, abolition came gradually. Chile in 1823, Mexico in 1829, Cuba in 1886, and Brazil was the last in 1888. It seemed as though the white man's conscience suddenly awoke. A beautiful thought, but of course the truth was far more complex. In his book Capitalism and Slavery, historian Eric Williams argued that this moral awakening was in fact driven by economic interests. His view was that slavery persisted as long as it was profitable, but once it became a burden, it was abandoned. During the 18th century, sugar and cotton were the lifeblood of Britain's wealth. But by the early 19th century, things changed. The Caribbean soil was exhausted and no longer as fertile. Intense competition from Brazilian and Cuban colonies flooded the sugar market and drove prices down. Meanwhile, Britain entered the Industrial Revolution. Factories, coal, and iron became more valuable than slave plantations. The new economy required a new kind of human being, free workers, paid for their labor, who could also become free consumers. People needed money so they could buy goods, because slaves who owned nothing consumed nothing. Poor slaves were bad for business. Now, society needed urban dwellers who could buy manufactured products, not enslaved laborers trapped in closed agricultural systems. Thus, slavery became a real economic burden. It was in the system's best interest to abandon it. As Williams noted, the abolition of slavery was the inevitable end of the feudal system. Once feudalism stopped being profitable, everything tied to it, like slavery, had to go. So yes, we can take moral credit, but Williams and other historians remind us why legal abolition didn't end racism or bring true equality. The social and economic structures built on slavery continued to shape societies long after it ended. Over time, these structures have been fading, which is progress, but they also shaped the racism and inequality still visible today. After Lincoln's proclamation, it actually took 2 years for emancipation to be enforced across the U.S. The famous promise of 40 acres and a mule was never fulfilled. Instead, a system called sharecropping emerged. It looked like a partnership, but it was a trap. Freed slaves worked white-owned lands for a share of the crops, but landowners forced them to buy seeds and tools on credit at inflated prices. With no savings, debt piled up year after year. The result? Black farmers generated wealth for their former masters, but lived in extreme poverty. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws were introduced. Slavery had ended, but racial segregation was legalized. These laws lasted until the mid-20th century. So, yes, slavery was abolished by law, but its legacy of racism and inequality endured. The story didn't end. It merely changed form, reappearing as new types of exploitation in our modern world. Although slavery is now officially illegal everywhere, sociologists say it still exists in hidden forms. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, in 2021, around 50 million people live under conditions that can be classified as modern slavery. The most widespread form is forced labor, with over 27 million people working in inhumane conditions in sectors such as agriculture, mining, fishing, and construction. Many are trapped by debt or coercion. Such practices are still found in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and even in developed countries, though more subtly, especially among undocumented migrants. Another dangerous form is human trafficking. Children and women are lured with false promises of work or education, only to end up in sexual exploitation or forced labor networks. There are an estimated 25 million victims, 70% of them women. Human trafficking is one of the most profitable criminal industries in the world, generating $150 billion annually. Statistics also show that over 130 million children are forced to work, 54 million of them in hazardous environments like mines, factories, or even as child soldiers in armed conflicts. You might ask, is this really still happening in the world I live in? Please, don't talk as if you're living in Mallorca, my friend. It is happening. Despite all global efforts, international laws, and United Nations initiatives, this remains a massive challenge. Modern slavery hides behind other industries. It's not always visible, but it persists. In the end, modern slavery is a grim reminder that human exploitation still exists. The same racist logic that once justified the Atlantic slave trade, the belief that some people are less human and can be used or killed without guilt, still echoes today. Despite this darkness, slavery's history is also a story of resistance, hope, reform, and human progress. Humanity once accepted these horrors, but it also fought them and overcame them. And we will continue to fight as long as slavery, in any form, still exists. Yes, the picture is grim, but remember how things once were and how far we've come. We are not bound to live in such a world, and history proves that we don't have to.